Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Little. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Pfluger. Today we have a great opportunity to talk with Jeff Jackson here regarding managing fisheries and ag-dominated landscapes. And we're really looking forward to this episode. It really ties into some of the past discussions we've had around nitrates and other water-related questions that have come up. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to him and let him give a quick introduction of himself and education experience, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Jeff Jackson. I have worked for the Nebraska Game Parks for about 30 plus years. Started out as a fisheries biologist, worked up to a supervisor for the southeastern portion of Nebraska. And then about the last 5 years, I've been managing the Aquatic Habitat Program for the Nebraska Game Park. So I do projects around the state to improve habitat and fish and access for anglers.
Okay. That's awesome. Yeah, well, it's definitely much needed for sure, and you have a lot of great resources, water resources here in the state, and so thinking about the continuity into the future generations, maintaining them, and so you guys do a lot of great work in that arena. So
yep, never lacking projects.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm sure there's always something to be done.
There is.
So growing up, did you always have your eyes set on something in the fisheries or wildlife management area, or how did that passion grow?
What Andy was saying a little bit earlier about his dad having an influence on his career. Well, my dad was he taught biology, taught ecology, loved to hunt, fish. So whenever he was going, us kids were tagging along with him. So yeah, it was just a natural, I guess, for me. Started out as a biology major, and I looked at what you do as a biology major, and it's like you can either teach or go to med school, and I really didn't want to do either one of those. So I opened up the syllabus and kind of went through it, and it's like, fish management seems like a good direction for me. So
that's really cool.
That's kind of how that worked. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it's good to hear, too. I always try to bring a lot of these episodes back and note, we have students that listen and that may be in a similar boat as you, kind of thinking about, like, directionality, where do I go? Exactly. And it's really cool to hear that perspective, because I think that's so important that there are opportunities out there and just kind of finding what best fits your career interest. And as I mentioned earlier off air, my original plan was to be a professional bass fisherman. I realized pretty quickly the amount of time you had to be in the water and doing all that, it was going to take a lot of time and effort, and I decided to kind of go a little different direction. But the point is that I ended up, in my case, looked into that, kind of got me into the interest in fisheries and wildlife, and then ended up going on to Penn State, where I got my degrees at from my undergrad degree and fisheries and wildlife. But again, that was kind of another thing that kind of got me interested in that realm of fisheries and wildlife management.
So I'm sure there's quite a bit that goes into fisheries ecology and management of a fishery. So before we go too far, we'll jump into some of the basics, I guess. So sure. This is a loaded question, but what does a successful fishery look like in your eyes? And I know there's small ponds, lakes, rivers, streams, but
sure.
Can you just run through the basics for us?
Sure. I mean, in most small lakes, basically what drives a fishery is your bass fishery, because they control everything, And so if you have a healthy bass fishery, you're going to have a healthy bluegill, crappie, channel catfish fishery.
That's good.
So, and I always go back to what really drives a good bass fishery, and it's water quality.
Okay.
You just can't separate yourself from that. And,
sure.
I managed lakes around the southeastern part of Nebraska and tend to have better water quality up north, up in Omaha, Lincoln. And as you go down, you start to see a degradation in water quality, and it's more of a function in that instance of the type of sediment that goes into a lot of these reservoirs, and they just have more clay and it stays suspended. And a lot of times you can just go to a lake and look at the water quality, and I could tell you whether it's a good fishery or not. And it's just because if you don't have good water quality, you don't have very good zooplankton, you don't have very good phytoplankton. And if you don't have the building blocks for a fishery, you're not going to have a good fishery to start. So it always starts with water quality.
That's really good.
So you mentioned bass are really a driving factor in a productive fishery. Which kind of surprises me because I would have thought it might have been the bait fish or the smaller fish that those bass are feeding on. Can you kind of unpack that a little more?
Sure, yeah. So bass controls your bluegill and crappie because they prey on the small fish. So if you have a really low bass density, then they're not effectively preying on those bluegill and crappie. So that's when you start seeing balance issues where you get stunting of your bluegill and crappie. So that's why I always say, it's really the driver of your fishery is your bass fishery.
Can it maybe, so bass would be the predator in this scenario. Are there other species that can fill that niche of a bass, or is it really just bass?
Sure. You can add, channel catfish do some predation. They just don't tend to be that density that really is a controlling factor, especially in small lakes. When you get out of, 200, 300, 400 acre lakes, the drivers become all different, and it becomes a lot more complex. So I tend to, try to focus more on things that I can really explain and understand. And smaller reservoirs are really a lot more simpler systems.
Sure, yeah. Well, I know, like growing up in Pennsylvania, that's, most of what I was dealing with were just farm ponds. So that's, which of course we got a lot of them here in the state. And that's where I grew up learning about bass fishing. And actually some of the same principles you were mentioning earlier, I've been to ponds that had way too many bass and then ones that did not have enough in there. And they were a major factor in that, and you can see this, like, as you mentioned, kind of things kind of get a little out of whack and how that, has that ripple effect into the rest of the species in there. Yeah.
For the most part, are fisheries self-sustaining, or can they be self-sustaining? And then what does that life cycle kind of look like as a fishery would self-sustain?
Sure. So again, talking about smaller ponds, bass, bluegill, and crappie are all self-sustaining. A lot of our fisheries, we do an initial stocking of those species, and we never really have to go back to them unless we have a fish kill or something dramatic happens. So those fish are all self-sustaining. In most of these small ponds, you don't see any natural reproduction of channel catfish. Again, bass are very predaceous. Channel catfish are pretty slow growing, and you just don't get a chance to recruit in those type of fisheries. So in order to maintain a channel catfish fishery in small lakes, you almost always have to restock them, and they have to be about 8 to 10 inches in order to get through that bass predation phase. So we actually did a study on this. It was one of the first studies I did when I came here, and we looked at stocking channel catfish at 7, 9, and 11 inches. And we saw almost no survival of those 7-inch catfish.
Really?
So you really got to get them past that point where the 8 inches, you get about 3 times the survival.
Really?
To get to those.
Oh, wow.
And what's the difference in age there from 7 inches to 8 inches?
It's not so much more just holding them a little bit longer into the season, holding them at a lower density so that they grow a little faster to get them to that. Because we can get a 9-inch channel catfish in Nebraska in one growing season. So, but it's just we had to change some of our methodology, how we raise channel catfish to get them to that size. So.
Well, and I think one thing that's interesting, and you kind of think about this, and I'll give you an example, like from cattle. So it's you kind of, if you have too many cattle out there, in the landscape, you then have obvious problems with, weight gain. And so similarly, you can use fisheries example. And I've seen that. I remember being in a pond in Mississippi. It was actually a small little lake, and they actually were like encouraging everybody like, hey, we have way too many bass that are in this, length limit. We need to get, them out of here, this, range. And the point was, it was just they had just over, they're basically too plentiful of those individuals at that kind of range. And they're like, we need to reduce that so we can hopefully get some of these other bass into that, longer length and then, hopefully a heavier weight class. Right. But again, it's that stocking density perspective. And whether it's cattle or deer or anything else, a lot of those same principles apply. You get too many of one thing, you can have ripple effects.
I've used an example more of like planting corn.
Sure.
Like, well, why don't you put another row in between those two rows, and why can't you double your production? Well, it's like that soil can only sustain so much, and you don't increase your productivity if you just stick another row in there.
Sure. That's a great example. I like that. No, that's really good. Yeah.
So within a fishery, say people aren't really managing it in any specific way, are those populations of bluegill, crappie, and bass, are they going to fluctuate or do they stay pretty constant?
I'd say they stay pretty constant. One of the factors that can play into that would be harvest. Sure. I usually tell people, if you have a lot of people fishing your pond, you probably don't want to limit bass harvest. Sure. And really anymore, it's really not a big issue. Last 30 years, we've seen a lot of changes where we can hardly not get people to harvest bass anymore.
Sure.
And that wasn't the case. When I first got here, we'd opened Zarinsky Reservoir. We opened that with a length limit. But right before that, Weir Span out of Omaha, we had real issue with people over-harvesting bass there. So,
really?
So it hasn't been that long ago,
sure.
but the district biologists are trying a regulation where they're trying to push some harvest on some of those small bass and some of the Omaha reservoirs, and they're not getting people to harvest those fish.
Interesting.
So.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. And I mean, kind of as a side note, at least within my family and friends, personally, I don't hear of people wanting to eat bass. I mean, they're more going to target your panfish species. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, people say they're not good eating. I've tried bass and they're absolutely just
they
fine.
Are good. Yeah, I've had them before too. They are really good.
Well, some of the bass guys are probably cringing right now. But
the trophy.
I do tend to harvest more bluegill and crappie.
Sure,
I enjoy those. So.
Yeah.
Interesting. So when it comes to not necessarily talking about the fish populations within a fishery, outside sources, what are some of the top threats to a fishery?
Yeah, I'd say especially in southeastern Nebraska, the top threat are probably invasive species. Especially, we talk more about aquatic invasive species, and they can take on so many different roles. They can be invertebrates, plants, animals. They can be fish, and we have a lot of issues in this area, especially with people moving like common carp, shad, white perch, and they devastate fisheries. It's amazing what they do. Common carp feed by stirring up the bottom and uprooting vegetation, and you can actually go to a reservoir and almost tell if there's common carp in there
really?
Because of that stirring. And we've looked at different populations, and you can see a direct correlation between largemouth bass densities and common carp. And as soon as you get common carp in there, your bass densities drop. And we talked about earlier, when you don't have a healthy bass population, that affects your bluegill and your crappie. So those type of species are devastating. White perch can just dominate a fishery. You see your bass population drop, your white perch density skyrockets, and they just take over the whole lake. So we really try to get anglers not to move those type of fish.
Sure, yeah.
Are there maybe some misconceptions out there, or why are folks thinking that they need to bring in carp or white perch to a fishery?
Yeah, it's hard to get into the heads of people that move fish like that because they're so devastating. But sometimes they use them as bait. A lot of times we've gone to a lot more regulations limiting use of live bait.
Sure.
With some success, but yeah, it's like some people just don't think about what their actions can actually
Sure.
do. And
That's true.
And is it possibly a misunderstanding of they think they need to get more species in there for the bass to feed on? Is that
sure? I think there especially if there's shad being moved around. Sometimes they think, oh, I'll have a better bass fishery. And the short term is, yeah, you can get a better bass fishery because there's more prey. But after that, those shad become established. They'll tie up 80% of the biomass of a lake. So now what happens to your bass density? Your bass density starts to drop because they're preying on all the zooplankton.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and I think one of the things, and I think about this on the wildlife side, but specifically on the fisheries side, the agency has options there if landowners do want to reach out and say, hey, I want to do something different here. I want to maybe have more bass in my pond. I want to grow some trophy bass in here. You guys can give insight rather than reading some article that may or may not be true online and kind of saying, I want to replicate what this other state did and say the southeast somewhere here and really learn what should and shouldn't be done. And I assume it's just an opportunity. I think people can reach out. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. All of our fisheries biologists are listed in our fishing guide. They can reach out to them and get professional guidance on what they should do.
That's good. That's really good. Yeah.
You mentioned aquatic plants can also be an issue for fisheries. What issues are we looking at if you get an invasive aquatic plant species?
Sure, they're really tough to deal with because some of the species like Eurasian milfoil, curly leaf pondweed are fragmenters. So when you get a piece attached to your trailer, go from one lake to the next lake, you can actually reestablish those plants in a new lake, and it's nothing that you've done on purpose, but it's your responsibility to make sure you're not transporting those type of plants with you when you go from one lake to the next. And we've tried to do some limited applications to try to limit, especially like curly leaf and Eurasian milfoil. But it's so expensive, and you really have a limited window when to treat those type of plants. So we do some, but we don't do very much. So.
Sure.
And are those plants affecting the water quality, which is then hurting the fishery? Or
well, it's more that they can take over, and so when you have plants take over a lake, it's almost impossible to fish it. So yeah, it's not really hurting the fishery so much, but it's hurting people's ability to fish. Unless you get to a point where they just take over and then you get a dieback of the plants. Well, when a plant dies, it takes up oxygen, so you can actually have a fish kill because the plants die.
Well, that's a good plug in there for thinking about it. And to me, even though I do a lot of work in the upland game side, it's a lot of this kind of analogous type challenges in the fisheries realm that you're dealing with. And obviously we think about invasive plants into some of our uplands and trying to manage them and a lot of spraying, and it's difficult to do that and continue to keep up with it. It's almost at times like you feel like you're on the hamster wheel. Are you going to make progress? And so, and I've seen places where they've had to basically start from square one because they got such just really an impact of invasive plants in there that basically kind of essentially drowned out everything else in that pond. So
in the position I'm in now, we do a lot of sediment removal. And we're depositing that on some of these upland areas.
Sure.
And our wildlife staff are always concerned about getting that reestablished and spraying any invasives that come in right away and before they get established. So I hear that a lot on that end.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good segues into fisheries specifically within ag-dominated landscapes. So my first question here we're probably talking smaller ponds for the most part. Are these usually successful or unsuccessful fisheries, or what have you seen in your experience?
Sure. I mean, we can get successful fisheries in ag-dominated areas without any issue. These areas tend to be productive, and I always say water in Nebraska is on the verge of an algae bloom. almost always, because
Sure.
there's a lot of nutrients in our water. So you have to be careful in that aspect. Any additional nutrients, and you can get algae blooms, and so you have to be a little bit careful in that. And doing some treatment up above your ponds, having a buffer around them. Those are all real positive to help control nutrient runoff into your ponds.
Can you explain the algae bloom a little more and what that is actually caused by and what it is?
Yep. So it's basically phytoplankton, which are the basics of the food chain, or algae. And if you get a runoff or you get nutrient input, the first thing to respond to that's going to be algae, because they're very simple. They can respond quickly. And so that's why I'm saying, if you do an application of herbicide or any type of a nutrient, then you have to be careful you don't get runoff into your pond, because those algae can respond real quickly to that.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, and it's interesting, because I think about, even like the places I fished growing up as a kid and having areas around there, that buffer I think is really important, and thinking about any potential runoff you may have from your fields, and then maybe exacerbating that more, having additional nutrients in there. I've seen, like I said, countless ponds where you'd have major algal blooms, and I know here even within Nebraska we have that. And especially in the summertime, there's usually you're looking at it from the water quality and side of things. You look and say, okay, well, there are certain lakes, for example, that you see really high spikes, and again, there's a lot of reasons why that happens. But that's important, I think, having things in place that can help mitigate some of that potential runoff you may have.
Exactly. So, and we all realize, Nebraska is going to be an ag-dominated area, and I just think that there's things that we can do to limit some of that. Direct cattle access to a pond, that's usually not a positive. Just having some fencing around that helps reduce some of that, and maybe having an alternate water source.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point. I like that.
So when you have an algae bloom or algal bloom in a pond, how is that going to impact the fish species that are there?
Yeah, and it impacts it more from, first of all, your water quality can be impacted. Real dense algae blooms can really limit amount of light penetration, again, and then you're limiting, your phytoplankton development, and you always want to look at that foundation of your food chain. Another aspect is, if you get really dense algae blooms, you can get fish kills as a result of those. So again, having a healthy aquatic vegetation around your pond is actually a really good thing. It helps absorb some of those nutrients right away rather than getting an algae bloom. Your existing aquatic vegetation can absorb some of those nutrients pretty quickly as well. So that's always important.
Are there species that are better suited to capture some of those nutrients as they come in?
I think a lot of the pond weeds are really pretty healthy. Most of those are native to Nebraska, so those are good. Having like cattails and bulrushes around the perimeter of your pond are always good. Again, helps stabilize your shoreline. Helps that buffer in between your ag land and your pond. So those are always good. Those are always healthy to see surrounding a pond.
Yeah. And you mentioned buffers around a pond. Is there maybe a minimum width that a landowner should shoot for a buffer around their pond?
There's obviously, when you're in an ag, they're going to try to maximize the amount of area that they're probably going to farm. So I would say as a minimum, probably 30 feet would be a good starting point. I know that's a recommendation that comes through Iowa along their streams, a buffer of about 30 feet. And so I'd say that's a good starting point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know, so I work a lot in the realm too with prairie strips, and thinking about that from Iowa, and that is another opportunity I know where people put them in to address runoff into streams or other water sources like ponds. And you can, and as you mentioned too, like that's where minimum is really good to have that 30 feet. And then there are places, depending on topography and things, all these other factors like you were kind of alluding to, that you may end up having to expand a little bit more, but making it where you have at least something there to help address that. And I know those prairie strips are amazing at being able to help address water runoff and address water quality related issues. Is just one tool out there amongst many other tools that landowners can potentially put in on their property.
How steep an area is around
Sure.
probably helps dictate some of that as well.
Yep.
Oh.
Yep.
Yeah, touching on the point of sediment runoff as well, what are going to be some of those issues caused by sediment maybe washing away on an ag field into a fishery?
Sure. I kind of go back. We did a project at Conestoga Reservoir. So this is we completed that about 8 years ago.
Okay.
So when we first did an evaluation, we had hired a consulting firm to look at how much sediment did we actually have come into that reservoir. So this reservoir was built in the late 50s, early 60s, right in there. Not a lot of buffers and land practices at that point. So we had a lot of sediment that came in there. And so when they finally gave us a tab on how much sediment had come into this, and this was a 200-acre reservoir, and we had almost 1 million yards of sediment.
Wow.
So if you put that in dollars, we usually pay between $10 and $15 a yard to remove it from. So you're talking, if we wanted to restore that back to what it was in the 50s, you're talking $15 million,
Wow.
So annually, the Aquatic Habitat Program brings in $2.5 million from fishing license sales.
Wow.
So a lot of times I'm asked, why didn't you take more sediment out? It's like, you don't realize what you're asking. It's a huge amount. And if you actually took 1 million yards and piled it up, you're talking about a football field that's stacked 600 feet high.
Oh my goodness.
It's like you got a ski slope.
Yeah, sure.
We're gonna start managing skiers. So yeah, it's a big number, and you try not to get overwhelmed by that. Do what you can and try to restore it. But when you're managing a lot of reservoirs around the state, you can't put all your dollars into one lake and get public support. So.
Yeah, that number is just crazy to think about. I mean, that would affect the whole fishery, right? I mean, that's significant change.
Yeah, and as that fills in with sediment, you get less and less area that support a fishery. And we did a project at Olive Creek a lot of years ago, and hadn't gone back there and removed any sediment after that. And it's got to the point where it almost doesn't sustain a fishery anymore. So you go through some of those processes, and sometimes you just can't afford to go back there and fix some of that.
Yeah. Probably gets to a point, where you kind of have to prioritize where we need to best invest the limited resources that you have. You can't go everywhere. Yeah, wow.
And when you get to the point where it's not supporting fish anymore, is that because the depth isn't there?
Yep.
Just because it's filled up that much?
Yeah. When you just get so much sediment in there, you have to just figure out whether you're going to continue or not. And we've gone through some of those phases. So.
Well, that actually is just, I guess, reinforces another point back to prairie strips, is having things like that, those filters in their strips can really help mitigate that, so you don't have, if you already have a problem, don't want to make it worse.
Right.
But if you don't have a problem yet, you don't really want to get to having that problem.
Yeah. So. In Conestoga, we had some really high rates of sedimentation initially, and then, as we got NRDs established and they started doing work up in that watershed, and there's a ton of acreages out in that area, so there's a bunch of farm ponds. Well, those little farm ponds are really good at retaining sediment and nutrients. So we've seen a big change in the input from sediment into Conestoga now. So we felt it was worth going back there and removing a substantial amount of sediment. We know it's going to be fairly stable, and we're not having the input that we had previously. So
So I was going to ask you on the sediment removal. Can you just briefly kind of explain what that looks like? Just for somebody who has no idea when we're talking about sediment removal. Are you down there with a backhoe, or what are you actually doing?
So we don't have crews that can do that work. So we always we hire a consultant, get a design figured out, and then we put that out for bid, and a contractor will go in there and we have it removed from certain areas that are accessible. And one of the things we found out at Conestoga is when we looked at that sediment, we always thought that it stayed more in the upper end. You fill in and then move up.
Yep.
And that's really not true. It fills in from the front and comes back.
Oh, interesting.
And so that sediment that's up by the dam, that's really hard to remove because it stays wet. Hard to get a contractor in there to remove it. And if you do want to remove that, it's going to cost you about 2 or 3 times.
Wow.
So even on Conestoga, that contractor had to build some dikes and then excavate and then pull the dikes out as he went. So it's a bigger process. It's more expensive.
Sure.
An engineering feat, no doubt.
It is. And they get stuck and it's not an easy job.
Yeah.
And so are they reaching down there with a backhoe bucket and just pulling out buckets of sediment, muck, basically?
It's a process. If we can dry it out, we're a lot more efficient.
So is that like typically you just drain the lake down to a point as much as you can? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you mentioned after the sediment is actually removed from the water body, there's a whole nother side of dealing with the actual sediment. Where is that taken? What is it used for?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question because a lot of people think, you just put it on some farm ground or, you can just move it over here. Well, that doesn't work out 99% of the time. We've done hundreds of projects around the state, and I can only think of a couple opportunities where we were able to actually put it on a farm field.
Oh, wow.
There's just a really tight window there where you can put it. When we're depositing hundreds of yards of sediment, that's not what they want.
Yeah.
They don't want a field that's 600 feet high. So it's a real challenge on where you do that. At Conestoga, we found like 3 different areas where we were able to pile it up about 5-6 feet. Again, you got to spread it out over 20, 30, 40 acres. And then getting it reestablished with vegetation is always a concern for our wildlife staff. And so that's a process too. You got to limit how much runoff you get off of that sediment because you don't want to go right back into your lake after you took it out. So it's a process and it's always a challenge. It's the first question I always ask when we start a project is like, well, what are your thoughts? Where are we going to go with the sediment?
And I'm sure if it all worked out, I would think row crop producers would love to have it on their fields because it has to be extremely high in nutrients.
It worked really well. We've put it on some of our areas where we had food plots. And I know some of our wildlife staff has commented that they haven't grown corn like they did after we put that sediment in there. So.
That's really cool.
I'm sure it's almost just like fertilizer.
It's productive. It's your best soil.
Yeah.
It's coming off of your topsoil. And it's like that's why it's really important why producers, try to minimize what they're getting for runoff because it's their best stuff. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and as one producer in the Northeast told me, he said, we're not making this stuff every day. And so it's like, how do we continue to keep it where it's at as opposed to having it run off into our streams and ponds and such. So.
And what time of year are you mainly removing sediment?
We do projects all year round. So it just depends on the lake and when we bid it out and when we have a contractor on hand. So
yeah, and I was just curious because to your point, it's probably extremely difficult lining up with a row crop producer when you can be out there just driving across their field, broadcasting soil. So yeah,
no, we got something to work out. We're doing a project at Smith Lake, which is up by south of Shadron.
Oh yeah.
So way up there, and we've worked out with the landowner some areas where he wanted to get some of his ground stabilized, and like I said, that is one of the only times that it's worked out. So.
Wow. Well, it's also, I think, kind of you're talking through that, it sounds like it's quite a process in planning. It's not something you decide, hey, we're going to go do this tomorrow kind of thing. This is like, I'm sure you have a lot of, opportunities to engage the public and such and kind of what that process looks like. But, in general, so like we'll say Conestoga as an example, like how long of a time frame was that to get some of those things planned and implemented? And
on average, just the planning part and permitting and design takes us over a year.
yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah.
So yet, I know there's been some comments, out of southeastern Nebraska has kind of been in a drought.
Sure.
And we've had some reservoirs that are down, and they're like, why don't you go in there and take some sediment out? It's like, well, you don't understand the processes,
Sure.
And any of the core dams, that's a whole nother process. The core is a little more difficult to work with sometimes just because of the processes you have to go through and the permitting that you have to go through to do work on their areas. So
well, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons we built this podcast, or Andy built this podcast, is to give just folks out on the landscape or the general public a peek behind the curtain, right? So hearing just straight from the Nebraska Game and Parks, why can't you just go out there tomorrow and do it? So, I mean, I think that's extremely important. You saying like, hey, there's a bunch of roadblocks before we can do any of this.
Yeah.
I have 2 or 3 projects in permitting and planning and design than I do on construction.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, and I could see that because I think that's helpful too, to really kind of explain that process of what you guys go through, because just as you're saying, even like on a research project episode that we had, like what all goes into this? Like it's just, and it's easy, I think, if you're not a part of that, to just say, well, it should just be easy. It should be, and it's like, well, there's a lot of pieces here. And you guys are obviously from the engineering side, as you were talking about, designing maybe new changes to the way that lake or, reservoir is laid out. And you have to make that. I kind of think of like Holmes Lake as an example here. You guys obviously, it was part of like making changes there, kind of structurally where you want certain things to be placed. And again, it doesn't happen overnight to kind of figure all those little intricate pieces out.
You think about Holmes Lake, all the players that are involved in something like that. We had the NRD, we had the city, we had the Game and Parks, we had park planners, we had, a trail system around there that we were working on. And it was, and we actually tried to put some of the material on the golf course.
Oh, yeah.
And that didn't go over very well, to tell you the truth.
It wasn't going to be super nice and green.
It was going to be a lot better hazard.
Yeah, a lot better.
I don't need any of those on the golf course when I'm out there, just to be clear.
Spend all your time in the hazard zone.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're talking permitting, are those usually state permits that you need to get? Are they federal permits or?
Mostly all state permits.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then kind of circling back kind of the beginning of this conversation, you talked about Conestoga, and above Conestoga, the best management practices have actually changed over the years. So that's why you can dredge Conestoga, if I understood you correctly. What are some of those practices that are now implemented above Conestoga that have reduced runoff into the water body?
And one of the things, when we started the Conestoga project, the first thing we did was contact a lot of those people up in the watershed with their ponds, because if we have carp up in one of those ponds, we redo all this work down in Conestoga. We get a runoff event and there's carp right back in there. And we're almost starting from square one. So we contacted as many of those landowners and pond owners that we could to find out if we had any issues up in the watershed. And actually, that was one of those first times we didn't find any issues. A lot of decent fisheries up there. So that was kind of square one when we started that project. But that's one of the big changes, is there's been a lot of acreages that have developed up there. So a lot of that ground is pretty stable. It's not farmed. They've, planted it. We just didn't see a lot of the runoff like we'd seen before.
Sure.
But even the farm fields, there's more buffers. There's more practices that are, no-till, leaving, planting a cover crop, or any of those practices that help reduce that sediment load into Conestoga were really a big benefit.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and that really is also part of this emphasis with the podcast is sharing those success stories out and sharing the practices that people can implement on their properties. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is finding ways we can holistically build our systems, our working land systems in ways that are obviously benefiting the production side of things because we have to feed and fuel the world, but doing that in the most sustainable way and ensuring that we have fisheries for the future and you have opportunities to take your kids out fishing, have places to hunt and recreate and things like that. And how do we figure out the most holistic system? Doesn't mean that it's going to be a cookie cutter approach for every place, as we all know, but finding different areas where you can get different partners together working with landowners and finding solutions that work best for that, geographic area.
Yeah.
So
we did a lot of work in Wagon Train.
Oh, yeah.
This is actually, we went back to Wagon Train, did some work there, and then we went into a drought.
Oh, sure.
Anyway, we haven't got that thing refilled. It would be nice if it would fill up, but only Mother Nature is going to do that for us. But the original project that we did extensive work with the NRD to identify areas that we're seeing a lot of sedimentation off of, to work with those landowners, looking at the different incentives and the different types of practices that could go on in those different areas. And like you said, it's an individual thing. Some work, some don't. But we got a lot better farm practices up in that watershed as a result of that. And a lot of it was, 80, 90% cost share.
That's awesome.
And that you get a lot more people to the plate when you're talking that type of money. So, so we got a lot better practices and we got a lot better control of sediment coming in there.
Yeah. Well, and I think into the future, I think that's going to be kind of the, precedent, especially as a lot of organizations are facing budget cuts. It's kind of these co-sharing resources across the board, collaborating together and finding ways that we can all kind of work together, and then maybe creating kind of stackable enterprises for landowners, finding, they can take some of those acres out and turn that into this, and that helps provide an additional stream of income for them. And again, and then you start to see those maybe more indirect effects because of those practices that on the landscape. In this case, better fisheries, less sediment coming off those fields into some of these reservoirs. So, yeah.
When it comes to walking back an introduction of, say, common carp or white perch, which are problem species, as you mentioned, what are the steps can you fully eliminate species in a fishery like that, or is it pretty much just try to control them and hope for the best?
We have. We've been able to eliminate them. When we do a renovation like Conestoga, we drew that reservoir down, and then we did an application of rotenone. And rotenone it's a chemical that inhibits the ability of the fish to take up oxygen across their gills, but it eliminates all the fish. So we're basically starting from scratch. And I just talked to some of the Southeast staff, the biologists there. They're going to do a treatment at Olive Creek. Again, that reservoir is really low. It's got common carp in it. They're going to do an under ice treatment on those common carp because there's only about a foot or two of water in there. So it's pretty efficient, economical for us to treat in that situation. So
what's kind of the time frame? How long do you have to wait until you can restock? I mean, obviously you need proper or enough water in there, right? But how long does that chemical hang around?
Enough water is a good start. The other issue is rotenone degrades depending on the water temperature. So right now, an under ice treatment could stay active for a couple of months. So, and obviously we're not stocking fish this time of year anyway, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, we'd also want enough water in there to restock it as well.
Yeah.
But typically, rotenone will degrade in about 2 weeks during the summertime. So then those situations you can restock pretty quickly.
So it kind of sounds ideal. I mean, apply it in the winter and try to get rid of all those problem species and then restart fresh in the summer.
If it works out, this isn't a treatment we've done very often. This is kind of maybe experimental on our part to see how well it works. So.
Well, I think it's neat that you're trying new things to, have another tool in the toolbox. It's always important.
Yep.
When it comes to putting fish into a fishery in a dominated ag landscape, are there species that are better equipped to handle smaller ponds? Can you speak on that a little bit?
I don't know if it's so much ag related or just water temperature, but a lot of times we see a little better survival on like yellow perch when you go north. But we have been actually trying some yellow perch stockings in some of the Omaha area and been pretty successful. But you think about perch and northern pike and walleye, you think of them as being more of a northern species, but at the same time we have pretty good populations of all three of those. So
yeah.
When it comes to eating or harvesting fish out of smaller ponds that maybe that there's runoff coming into that fishery, are there any concerns with eating those fish after you harvest them? What are your thoughts there?
Really, nutrients don't have an effect on whether a fish is edible or not. I think when you start talking about metals and stuff like mercury, that's when you start having an impact on whether you should consume very much fish. And the NDEE or whatever abbreviation you have for the Department of Environmental Quality now, they recommend, like in areas where they sample mercury, that you only eat like 8 ounces of fish fillets a week to limit your exposure. Sure. But other than that, there's really not a lot of concern as far as nutrients are concerned, as far as whether a fish is edible or not.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that because I know like when Dewey puts out their and especially in the summer times, usually when we're looking at, because of my wife's family, we got a lake house out, and her family has a lake house in Johnson Lake, and so we go out there, and we're always looking online around the July 4th time frame. Is there going to be any water related issues? Going out swimming. But I know as a part of that, they do post things on there. Maybe you shouldn't be consuming things caught in this area because of X, Y, or Z that they've found in there. So I know that's always a publicly available information that's shared out there.
Exactly. So. And they put out, advisories if there's a blue-green algae bloom. Sure. Those can be fatal to. I know we've had some issues with people losing dogs when they were swimming in a lake with a high density of blue-green algae. So that's always a concern. I tell people, if you get a high density of algae anywhere, you probably don't want your dog swimming in that.
Yeah,
or your kid swimming in that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, great point. And I did actually mean to ask you about that, and I kind of glossed over it. Are all algae blooms bad for people and or fish?
They are not. And blue-green algae, you can usually tell. It almost looks like you painted it on a rock or something. It's a definitely different color than what you see with a typical algae bloom.
Okay. That's good to know, yeah.
And where does the Game and Parks actually post that information on maybe rec areas that have it?
Right. So they do post it online, and they also post it at like a beach advisory.
Oh,
those are the main ones that they test, are areas with beaches.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And another portion of this podcast is actually designed for landowners themselves and helping them manage their property and ponds on their property. So say there's a landowner who is maybe reworking a pond or wants to start a pond. What are some of the things they should think about, and how far out should they start thinking about that, and just kind of run a landowner through getting that pond going from start to finish?
I can kind of give you this is a little bit different type of example, but this is a landowner. He lived way down in southern part of our district, and he was actually putting in a well and digging this pond out. And he came to our office and was like, how do I design this for smallmouth bass and yellow perch type fishery? And so we talked about that, putting more rock structures in. Water quality is key for smallmouth bass, and he was pumping this lake in with a well. So really you can design whatever you want at that point. He was an engineer, so money was less of an issue than with a lot of other people, So anyway, he he went through the whole process and sent me pictures afterwards, and it really turned into be a really good fishery.
That's awesome.
But really, he started from the ground. He said, "What do I need to do to make this a good smallmouth bass fishery?" He goes, "I got plenty of largemouth bass fisheries I can fish. I want to fish for smallmouth."
Huh.
So
That's really
that's
cool.
one example. If you're doing like just a regular pond with a dam and a watershed, really reducing that sediment input's key to maintaining that pond long term.
Sure.
How deep should a general farm pond be to sustain a healthy fish population?
We usually recommend like 10 to 12 foot over 25% of the area.
Okay.
And I always say that's a minimum.
Sure.
If you have a lot of sediment coming in, then you really need to account for that. And one of the things that we do on some of our public lakes is putting in a sediment dam.
Oh.
And what that does is it slows down the water when it's coming in. It gives a place for that sediment to deposit, and it's a lot easier to remove from a sediment dam than in your main pond.
So that's actually a really good example for landowners. So then essentially if they come to you and say, hey, I want to do this, or like, hey, I'm starting from square one, I would like to put in a pond, or hey, I'm maybe having to do some changes to what I currently have. That's part of that discussion of kind of like, what can I do? Because there's obviously thinking about, I can't control my neighbors and what they have coming in. And so how do I kind of mitigate that so I don't have a bigger problem down the road? And so that's type of information they can work with you guys to get that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then, and I always try to get them to consider access as well.
Sure.
If you've got a good fishery, you've got good aquatic vegetation, getting people out a little further out, to get to that 10, 12 foot of water where you don't have as much aquatic vegetation is key to providing a real successful fishery.
That's a really good point. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. And I like the point, Andy, about just preventative maintenance. If you can build that sediment dam and really set yourself up long term, I would think that would be ideal.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just easier to remove,
Yeah.
You're not dealing with a 200-acre lake, but it's still more expensive to remove that in the main body than if you can remove it from a sediment dam.
Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but landowners can actually work with game and parks biologists at no cost, right, to get answers to their questions, help design.
Exactly. Any our biologists are more than willing to help, with those questions, especially managing a fishery, how to design a pond to maximize your fishery. Those are all good questions for them or for me.
Yeah, that's good. Well, and I think that's one of the things. I know I was talking with TJ Walker before a Game of Parks, and TJ said, that's one of the things that a lot of people are just not aware of, that people can call in and ask if they need assistance. We will provide the assistance with them if they're interested in, say, cover for upland game birds like pheasants or quail, or in your case, fisheries, thinking about pond management. Like, we have the experts here and that are great resources. So if people have questions, they can call in and set up a time to meet and chat and discuss what's best for my operation.
What's more frustrating is when you're answering the questions after they've already done that.
Well, that's
they said, why wasn't this successful? Or I added grass carp to my pond, now what?
Sure. Yeah.
And it's like, well, that wasn't a good move to start. So
that's probably got to feel like a little bit of a pit in your stomach when you hear that.
It is. It's like, well, you adjust, but yeah, if they just ask us to start, again, we can mitigate some of those things beforehand. So
yeah.
Are there any programs or funding sources that are available for producers to maybe revamp a pond or just build a pond from scratch?
There really aren't. That's kind of a frustrating thing, but there really just aren't public funds that are available to really help with that. Sometimes, we've had programs to develop ponds, but then to go back and rehab them, there's some of the NRDs have done some work on those, but there's not a lot of funds available. But that would be the first place I would probably address or go to, would be the NRD and see if they have funds available to help. Some of these ponds are, a lot of ponds were built in the 50s and 60s, and so the tubes going through them are starting to degrade because that's about as long as those metal tubes will last. So I know the NRDs have been going through and replacing some of those in a limited number if they're important to them. So
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and actually on that topic, I think that's important too for people to, again, know that there's resources out there. And I keep harping on that a lot because I think it's one of the underutilized things in a lot of cases. And I liked your point about like after the fact, because if you know the resources are available, then it's like easier to go get some of those questions answered now. But I am interested to hear that, from that public side of things, I could see maybe why there's some limited resources available in that arena, but at least people should check into that because maybe, who knows, maybe there is something that will be available at their local NRD or another resource or whatever out there before they jump into something like that.
We've mentioned stocking a number of times throughout this discussion. When it comes to stocking a pond, are the Nebraska Game and Parks, are they raising the fish that we stock in these different ponds and reservoirs, or where do we get those species?
Okay, so in some circumstances, we do stock bass and bluegill in a limited number of ponds. And basically, it has to be a pond that went dry or that we're starting from scratch. It's a new pond because bass and bluegill are really self-sustaining, so we can do a one-time stocking and we don't have to go back there and keep on restocking it to maintain a fishery. And those are free. They just have to contact the Nebraska Game Parks. And Jordan Cott is one of the guys that manages that program for us. So one of the misnomers is if we stock it, they don't have to allow public access. So we do keep a list, and people can come down and find out what areas that we stocked with fish. But again, they still have to get permission from the landowner before they can access those.
And I personally never knew that. I mean, being in the conservation realm, I never realized that landowners could reach out for stocking assistance.
Yep.
Now, is the Game and Parks, are they actually raising those fish?
Yes. Yep. Okay. Most of those fish are raised out at our Valentine hatchery.
Oh, okay.
So there's other examples, but again, we just stock bass and bluegill, channel catfish, which is one of the things that we recommend to landowners to stock. They would have to stock those on their own.
Okay.
And we give them a list of hatcheries where they can acquire those and work with them, give them some good direction on how many and what sizes to stock, because we know if they're stocking 3-inch channel catfish in an existing bass fishery that they're doing a great job of feeding their bass. So.
That's good point.
Yeah, I'm sure that's extremely helpful for a landowner where you guys have kind of all those calculations written out, and you can just tell them, hey, put this many 100 in at this size, and you should be off to the races.
And I'll make a little plug for the research side. That's why I like agencies like Nebraska Game and Parks Commission who are doing the research and working with researchers. You have that backing versus maybe a company that doesn't really have that, and they're out there obviously selling a product. And I think at the end of the day, it's an opportunity for co-collaboration because the companies are there to sell a product, but they're working, kind of in, as you mentioned, like having a list. Like you have a list of different companies that are out there. That's an opportunity to take and work with you guys, figure out what's, is this a good decision, for me to do that, but having that kind of collective guidance to make the best informed decisions as opposed to just kind of trying it out. And then, like you said, you're down the road and you're like, oh, shoot, now I got a bigger problem than what I expected in the beginning. So
reach out before you take any action. It's probably a good point to make.
I mean, it's just a good. We're going to probably save you money in the long run. You do it right the first time.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So before we wrap up here, Andy kind of mentioned research. Do you and your team, do you have any active research going on, or is there any research that you're maybe hoping to kick off here in the next few years?
Sure. I mean, I don't actively do a lot of research. Again, I'm doing more rehab on lakes and streams and stuff. But to some limited extent, I kind of do some dabble in it. But mainly we have a research division that handles most of that research. They work with the university on a daily basis to design some of that. And there's ongoing research on Ogallala on that. We did a trout, did a renovation on that fishery to reestablish the trout fishery, and they're following through on doing some research there. That's maybe the best example I can give you right now.
That's perfect. I mean, obviously making sure those management practices are playing out how they're supposed to, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we're constantly evaluating our stockings, trying to be as efficient as we can with them.
That's good. Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really good point too, is that's part of that research, is that you're also evaluating the success of these things. And I think it's important that we're constantly striving to do the best, and, we're not going to kind of continue just doing something because we just did that for years and years and years, but we're actually constantly, as you're saying, making this better and better, and is in theory what we want to be able to do through time.
One good example, this is research that we did a few years ago, but we were looking at advanced walleye in some of our southeastern fisheries, and we'd stock fingerling and fry in some of our reservoirs for years, and they really didn't pan out very well. And so on a limited basis, we started stocking some 8-inch advanced walleye, and we saw some really amazing results. We were getting really good survival on these where we hadn't seen any survival for a long time. It's really just getting it through that predation window.
Oh, that's interesting.
And again, these are bass-dominated fisheries, and if you don't get them to that 8 inches, you may not be getting very good survival. So that's an example. There's I fish wildwood quite a bit, and I've been able to catch quite a few walleye in that reservoir, and it's as a result of those advanced walleye. But on the flip side, they're really expensive to produce. So there's a payback there. It's like we can stock 1,000 2-inch walleye, or do you stock 100 advanced walleye? So you got to make those numbers work for you. But we have been able to establish some walleye fisheries where we hadn't been able to before.
So if you get walleye established within a body of water, do they fill the niche of bass, or can bass and walleye coexist?
Yeah, we've seen pretty good examples of where they coexist, but we're not establishing a really high density walleye population by any means. So, but if you did get a really high density of walleye, they would definitely be competing with your largemouth bass. So we just haven't seen that.
And I've heard good things about wildwood, so people are going to be going to check fishery. It out now. Yep. When you're stocking walleye or different species in different bodies of water, is that mainly because the public is asking for that, or who's making these decisions?
So yeah, when we do angler surveys, that's one of the top things that people want to fish for. So that's one of the reasons why we adjusted some of our stockings, because we knew people were asking for that, and if we can provide it and we can afford it, then those are some of the answered questions that we were asking there.
Well, and I think that's a great point for folks out fishing. If you see somebody who's trying to get you to take a survey, those surveys are extremely important.
Yeah, exactly.
Take the time and be nice to that individual, because it could benefit you in the long run on what you're wanting in a fishery.
I actually got creeled, which is a creel survey is one of the biologists or staff would come down and ask you questions about how long you fish, what you caught, and I actually got creeled the other day ice fishing.
Wow!
So yeah, I haven't been creeled in a long time, and I only been out ice fishing twice this year.
Oh wow!
I don't know if you've seen, but we haven't had much good ice this year.
Much ice.
I was going to say 2 times is pretty lucky. I'd say this year.
Yep, and I don't think I'm going to get out again from the forecast right now.
Yeah,
but I'm not complaining about the warm weather, but it doesn't do very good for ice fishing.
So. No, you'll have to head far north if that's the plan.
Exactly.
So, that's really good.
And I think we ran through most of my questions. Andy, did you have anything else that you wanted to
cover? The only other question I did want to ask, just because we're wrapping up here and you mentioned advanced walleye. So what are advanced walleye? Is that like some mutant walleye or something like that? Or what is that?
Yeah, they're just fish. When we raise them in the hatchery, we can get them to 2 inches on just zooplankton populations that are in our hatchery ponds. But walleye switch over, they become piscivorous, or they eat other fish after about 2 inches. Yep. And so if you want to raise an 8-inch walleye, you got to get them on minnows. And So that's how come our costs escalate, because we have to start paying for minnows to get them to that 8 inches. Yeah. So,
no, that's good. I was just kind of curious. I figured there might be other people out there asking, what is an advanced walleye?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, no, that is and, sometimes we just throw those terms out there and think the public knows what we're talking about, and that's a good example of something that they probably don't know. So.
Yeah, no, that's cool. No, this has been great. I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely. And I think just the raising of fish, that could be a whole nother episode in itself that maybe we should look for in the future, because I think there's a lot of neat stuff to unpack there.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, we have staff that manage our hatcheries and our staff, and it'd be a really good resource for you.
That'd be awesome.
Well, thanks again, Jeff. We appreciate you taking some time out of your busy day. I know everybody's busy, so thanks, and really looking forward to getting this episode out to the public.
Very good.
Thanks again. I appreciate it.
No problem. Glad to help.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Are you enjoying the Wild Ag Podcast? You or your organization can sponsor upcoming episodes that bring important information to listeners just like you. To learn more, visit our website, go.unl.edu/wildag.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.